Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into something I know you're all super passionate about, social justice.
Right.
And we'll be looking closely at the Right to Contraception Act.
It's HR 4121.
Yeah, HR 4121, thanks for that.
Yeah.
And you care about equity, and this act really gets into the nitty-gritty of personal autonomy, healthcare access, and how those all kind of intersect.
Yeah. I mean, this act is really all about making sure people can get and use contraception.
Right.
And pushing back against anything that tries to limit that, like how people get contraception, how they use it, even just finding information about it.
Yeah. I noticed right away that this bill was introduced by a huge bipartisan group of representatives.
Over 150.
Yeah, over 150. That's got to be like a good sign, right?
I think so, yeah. Especially right now when reproductive rights are, such a big issue.
Yeah.
It's such a hot button issue. So to see that level of support from both sides.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a real commitment there to protecting access to contraception, no matter what party you're in, you know?
Right. Right. It's hopeful.
Yeah, it's hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, there's some common ground in this area where things are usually so divided.
Okay, so I'm just trying to imagine what it would even mean to live in a world where access to contraception wasn't guaranteed.
Oh, wow.
It's kind of mind-blowing, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question. And the act itself really tries to address it.
Okay.
Right in the findings section
Yeah.
that lays out all the historical and societal context, reminding us why this legislation is so important. It comes right out and says, contraception is a fundamental right.
Yeah.
It's crucial for, individual well-being, but also for real equality, across the board.
Yeah, I noticed they mentioned a couple of big Supreme Court cases in there. Griswold, Eisenstadt, Carey.
Oh, yeah.
Those ring a bell.
Big time. Those are the cases that really set the stage for, the legal right to contraception here in the U.S.
Right.
Griswold, that was way back in the 60s, it said that married couples have the right to use contraception.
Okay.
And then Eisenstadt, that extended that right to people who weren't married.
Gotcha.
And then later on, Carey made sure that even minors had access.
Okay.
So these rulings, they really solidified contraception as a constitutionally protected right.
Yeah.
And this act is basically building on that legacy.
Okay, so the act also talks about how international organizations, like the UN, they recognize access to contraception as a human right.
Yeah.
Is that just symbolic, or does that actually have some teeth?
Oh, it's definitely not just symbolic. Aligning U.S. law with global human rights standards can actually have a real impact on, foreign policy and global health initiatives.
I see.
Think about it. The U.S. taking a stronger stance against countries that have, coercive reproductive policies, forced sterilization programs. Or it could mean more support for international family planning programs, a stronger commitment to reproductive health as part of, development aid.
Okay.
It's about actually putting our money where our mouth is on the world stage.
Got it. Okay. One thing that really kind of surprised me is how the act goes beyond just preventing pregnancy. It really emphasizes the positive impact contraception can have on a person's overall health.
Totally.
So it seems like it's not just about family planning.
It's not. The act actually calls out that many forms of contraception can help to prevent and treat certain medical conditions.
Yeah.
And even reduce the risk of certain cancers. It's a reminder that access to contraception is about, comprehensive health care.
Yeah.
Not just this one specific aspect of it.
It's amazing how something we often just take for granted can have such a huge impact on someone's well-being.
Totally.
But the act also talks about the darker side of things, right? Forced sterilization and limited access for certain groups. That's a pretty sobering reminder of how social justice ties into all of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how does this act address those past injustices?
Well, it directly tackles discrimination. It straight up prohibits any restrictions on contraceptive access based on a whole bunch of factors.
Yeah.
Race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, you name it.
Wow.
The goal is to make sure that everyone, no matter their background or who they are, has the same rights and access when it comes to contraception. No exceptions.
Okay. But what about those healthcare providers who refuse to offer contraception because of their personal beliefs?
Right.
The act brings that up, right?
Yeah.
How does it deal with that potential roadblock?
So it has provisions that are meant to protect your right to access contraception,
Okay.
even if your provider has, like, a moral objection to it.
Wow.
The idea is that your right to this health care shouldn't depend on someone else's personal beliefs.
Yeah.
It's your health, your choices.
So, like, if a state tries to pull a fast one, right, and, like, restrict access to contraception, this act would, like, override those state laws.
Yeah. So it has what's called a preemption clause.
Okay.
Basically, it means federal law trumps any state laws that clash with it.
I see.
So imagine a state passes a law that, like, defines abortion so broadly that it includes certain types of contraception. This act would step in and say, nope, federal law protects access to contraception no matter what your state law says.
Wow.
It's a powerful safeguard, especially now when we see so many efforts to restrict reproductive health care at the state level.
Yeah, it sounds like they're trying to build a real, like, legal firewall to protect access to contraception no matter what.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But the act goes beyond just getting your hands on contraception.
Oh, right.
It also talks about the right to actually use it without coercion.
Yeah, you're totally right. This act is drawing a line in the sand when it comes to bodily autonomy. It's about making sure that people have the power to make their own choices about their reproductive health, free from any pressure or control from others.
It's kind of wild to think that, like, something as basic as choosing whether or not to use contraception could even be up for debate.
I know.
But here we are.
Yeah, it really shows how much of a struggle there still is for reproductive rights and bodily autonomy.
Yeah.
It's like a constant push and pull,
Yeah.
And this act, it's like a big push to swing things back toward individual choice.
Okay, so speaking of push and pull, you mentioned how this act would protect against state-level restrictions.
Right.
Can you, like, give me an example? What would that look like in real life?
Sure. So imagine a state passes a law that makes it, like, super hard for clinics to offer certain types of contraception.
Okay.
Which basically limits access for people who rely on those clinics, right? The Right to Contraception Act would come in and say, hold up, federal law guarantees access to contraception. You can't put those kind of roadblocks in place. It's about making sure that where you live doesn't determine if you can get essential health care.
So this act isn't just like some strongly worded letter, right?
Yeah.
It actually has some muscle behind it.
Definitely.
I'm kind of curious, how does it actually work? Like, what would it take to make this the law of the land?
Okay, so right now it's going through the legislative process.
Yeah.
It has to pass in both the House and the Senate. And then it needs to be signed by the president. It's like an obstacle course for important laws.
So it's got to jump a few hurdles. But if it actually becomes law, like, what kind of impact could we realistically expect to see?
I mean, if it makes it through, it would be a huge win for reproductive rights and healthcare equity.
Okay.
It would really cement the legal right to contraception at the federal level, providing a shield against those state-level attempts to restrict access.
Right.
And I think for a lot of people, that could be a huge relief. Knowing that their right to make their own reproductive choices is protected no matter what their state legislature might try to do.
Yeah, that peace of mind is so valuable. But what about, like, the bigger picture? What kind of ripple effects could we see for, like, society as a whole?
I think on a broader scale, we could see improvements in health outcomes overall.
Okay.
Especially for women in marginalized communities. They often have a tougher time accessing health care anyway.
Right.
We could see fewer unintended pregnancies.
Okay.
Which leads to better maternal and child health. And when families can plan when and if they have kids, it can mean more economic stability. It's all connected, really.
Wow, it's amazing how access to contraception can, like, have this ripple effect, impacting not just individual lives, but entire communities.
It really shows how these issues are all intertwined, Personal autonomy, healthcare, social justice, economic well-being.
Yeah.
Access to contraception isn't just about preventing pregnancy. It's about building a fairer and more just society, one where everyone has a chance to thrive.
Okay, so I noticed the act mentions the Attorney General. Like, they would have the power to take legal action against states that try to violate its provisions.
Right.
So does that mean we could see, like, some epic legal battles between the federal government and certain states?
Oh, it's definitely possible. The act basically gives the Attorney General the ability to file lawsuits against states that try to restrict access to contraception.
Wow.
It's basically saying, we're serious about protecting this right, and we'll fight for it in court.
Yeah.
The act also lets individuals and healthcare providers sue states or government officials who try to put those restrictions in place.
So it's not just symbolic, it's got some teeth.
Exactly. It's not just like a nice sentiment. It's a real piece of legislation with ways to make sure people follow it.
Yeah, it's incredible how much progress has been made with reproductive rights.
Totally.
But it also makes you realize how fragile those rights can be.
It feels like this constant back and forth, between people who want to expand access and those who want to restrict it. It's exhausting.
You're right. The fight for reproductive rights isn't over. It needs constant attention and people fighting for it. The Right to Contraception Act is a big step forward, but it's just one part of a much bigger picture.
Yeah.
We got to stay informed, stay involved, and keep pushing for policies that protect and expand access to reproductive health care for everybody.
Okay, well said. I'm definitely feeling inspired to learn more and see how I can get involved in supporting this act and advocating for reproductive rights in general. But before we wrap up, I have one more question. The act seems pretty thorough about who it protects, but I'm wondering about people in rural areas. They already have a tough time getting access to health care.
That's a really good point, and one that often gets overlooked. The act doesn't specifically call out rural communities.
But its overall focus on equity and stopping discrimination based on where you live suggests it would protect people in those areas.
So it's not just about big cities versus small towns. It's about making sure everyone, everywhere, has the same rights and access.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that access to health care, and that includes reproductive health care, shouldn't be decided by your zip code.
Yeah.
It's a basic right that everyone should have no matter where they live.
Yeah.
And that includes access to accurate information and resources. Imagine a young woman in a rural area whose only healthcare provider is against contraception.
Right.
This act would let her go somewhere else to get information and care. It ensures her right to make her own choices.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening. We've talked about the historical context, the specific legal details, personal stories, the broader societal impacts. It's clear that the Right to Contraception Act could be a total game changer for reproductive rights and healthcare equity. It really feels like a make-or-break moment for reproductive rights.
It is. And it's a reminder that, progress isn't always a straight line.
Right. There's always going to be people trying to take away our rights.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important to be aware, stay involved and to be ready to fight back.
Okay, so I have another question. Does this act say anything about what types of contraception would actually be protected?
It's written pretty broadly. It covers all those FDA-approved methods, services, and supplies. So it's open to including new things that come out, as reproductive healthcare changes.
Right.
That's really important because technology is always evolving.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure the law can keep up.
That's a good point. So it's not just about protecting what's out there now, but also what might come out in the future.
Right. Exactly.
This act really tries to think of everything.
Yeah. It's about being proactive and knowing that reproductive health care is going to keep changing.
We've talked a lot about the legal stuff and the big picture impact. But what about the personal side of all this? What does this act mean for people who are actually having trouble getting contraception right now?
For those individuals, it could really change their lives.
It would give them a sense of security and empowerment, knowing that their right to choose is protected.
Yeah.
It could be the difference between being able to plan their families and their careers, on their own terms, or facing unintended pregnancies and all the difficulties that can come with that.
Yeah.
It's about giving people control over their own lives and futures.
It's about dignity and agency.
Exactly. It's about respecting people's right to make decisions about their bodies and their lives without anyone butting in or judging them.
This deep dive has been, honestly, it's been eye-opening.
I agree.
I feel like I understand so much more now about how complicated reproductive rights are and how important this legislation is.
Me too. And I hope our listener feels the same way.
Yeah. So to our listener out there who's been with us on this journey, what's the main takeaway? What do you want them to remember?
I want them to remember that their voice matters, that they can actually make a difference. This act shows what can happen when people speak up, demand change, and fight for what they believe in. So stay informed, stay engaged, and don't underestimate how powerful your voice can be.
That's a great point. Well, thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the Right to Contraception Act. It's been quite a journey, but an important one.
Definitely. And remember, knowledge is power.
And to our listener out there, thanks for hanging out with us. We hope this has made you curious and given you something to think about. Until next time, keep diving deep.